I'm going to tell you something that is absolutely 100% academically true at the universities today. There is no university on this planet that can take one of these drugs that these female priestesses were using and explain to you what it did in the body. It's impossible. So they're using some kind of toxin on the arrow. And since they're constantly talking about where does the toxin come from the snakes. And what's beautiful is there's a remedy for this. Just pick a sex drug. Let me give you a good one. There's a drug that Mary Magdalene gives to Jesus. If you check it out in the Greek, there's not one name for one plant. What were the Christians battling that would make them want to do these strange rites? If you look at the Greek rites, they were attempting to copy the Greek rites at the same time to alter them so that the Greek gods would not be able to defend their own rights. Because they believe in demons. So you see this intense period of demon fighting, demon possession and demon fighting. It's through the drugs that they're putting on the phallus, and then they're either having vaginal or anal intercourse. You can use a statue of Priapus, you can use any of the Herms, and with the box that the Dionysiac troupe would carry around, they had some kind of instrument that they used to apply a drug. Talk about all the dirty stuff? It's okay. All right. Okay, fine. It's all clinical, though. Trust me, it's all clinical. Honestly, I'll say a few remarks, and I want to spend a good bit of time on questions, but I'll say just a few remarks. And I want to bring this down to where it's interesting. So I don't want to leave anything out. But you have to understand that I came from a background of having both the sciences and the humanities. So I have a degree in a PhD in classics. I do the Greek and Latin. That's my thing. Not even history so much as just the language. I read the text. I know how to work the grammar. That's my strong point. So what I did was I said, hey, there's all this scientific stuff out there that we don't have. We haven't translated. So I started working on it, and it just sucked me in. It's a huge, and let me explain to you what's going on, and then we'll talk about marijuana. So an idea that I came up with, I was having problem with the vocabulary, with the Greek vocabulary. And there are some big holes in the ancient Greek world that we try to plug over with kind of a Christian ideology. And I started calling this the Christian lens. When you try to take away the Christian lens, because the Christians are after the pagan cults all established, right? So you don't want to look at it through that lens. You want to see it as the pagans do. Let me give you one example. And I hate that word pagan because it's like using the N word. It's, women who are called pagans were killed. I mean, so, have a little respect, right? Don't use the term pagan. But the thing that I really think helped me to understand the text is when I put aside that Christian lens. And when you put aside that Christian lens, let me give you one example, homosexual. There's no word for homosexual in the ancient Greek vocabulary. There's no word for homosexual. There are entire books written about homosexuals, and there's no word for it in their own language. So were they looking at it different? One question academics love to ask was Achilles having sex with Patroclus? They loved it. And it's not just us. The Greeks did the same thing. They were talking about it too. But when you look at the way they were talking about it, it was not about orientation. There was no question of orientation involved. It's really weird. There's no concept of homosexual. There's no concept of heterosexual. And if you think about that, that makes an impact on society, just the language. So I started looking at the drugs, and I said, we've got to be able to figure out the drugs as we're figuring out the language. And I found a lot of let me put it like this. The drug lore, we call it drug lore. Makes it sound funny. But the drug lore of the Greeks, there are thousands of pages untranslated. Nobody translates this. The head of my dissertation committee told me, she said, you have to take this section out on recreational drugs from your dissertation on Roman pharmacy. I said, why? And she said, well, the Romans just wouldn't do such a thing. Right? These are the Romans we're talking about. These are the Romans. So I kind of had a drive. So the drugs, the plants become your genetic evidence. The myth is the amber. So we discovered a bee that was 20 million years old or something in amber. They took it out. They took the gut bugs out. They did a DNA analysis of the gut bugs, and they found out not what they expected, that these bugs in their guts had been almost unaltered for 20 million years. So it was kind of confusing because we thought, well, this will show us archaebacteria at its best. No, it really didn't. So what I'm trying to do is apply that same principle. Let's look at the amber. The amber is the myth. It's what holds in the cultural ideas. Let's look into the ideas and see what their DNA is. And that's what the drugs tell you. Because the drugs are constant. It's like one thing, it's triangulation basically. It's one way of figuring out what was going on in the culture by using a frame of reference. That's all. So when you look at the drugs in the ancient world, we're finding beautiful stuff. I'm going to give you an example. There are two authors from the ancient world that I want to tell you about. One is a guy named Dioscorides, and he is an author of all things herbal. He's a Roman physician, for lack of a better term. And then there's a priest who lived a couple centuries earlier named Nicander. Both of them write about drugs, but both of them write about drugs in a very different way. One is prose. It's Greek prose. It's just describe this X, Y, and Z. The other one is poetry. And it's a beautiful epic poem on drugs that priestesses use to get, not to get high, but to do their routines. And so if you trace the history of these drugs that these priestly colleges are using, I'm just gonna hit some major points about what the history is shaping up to look at. Like I said, break the Christian lens. The first thing that you all believe that is completely wrong is that women had no power in the ancient world, that they were slaves, they were chattel. You've heard this. You've heard this. Classes repeat this over and over and over again. And that's completely wrong. And the way that you can see this is the earliest medicine, we say, is Hippocratic, right? It's not. The earliest medicine is actually gynecological. You can look at the Hippocratic corpus and see that the Hippocratics were borrowing from a female tradition. And we have one text, The Diseases of Women, that scholars have said, this is written by one of the Hippocratics, Hippocrates or one of his students. And they smile and look at each other. It's not in English, right? They smile and look at each other. And in the text itself, it says, don't trust those stupid men physicians. You have to go to a woman because only we know the body. This is a document that is written by a man? Excuse me? It doesn't, there's problems. Something's going on here, right? Either they're not reading these things or they're not, I don't know, they're not understanding what the language is actually telling them. And that's what we get through the drugs. It's a point, it's an anchor point that we can fix on. So let me tell you about these priestly colleges, and I'll hurry up here because I'm droning on. I want to skip ahead and just tell you. So when you look at these drugs, pick a sex drug. Let me give you a good one that is something that you can kind of anchor yourself in. There's a drug that Mary Magdalene gives to Jesus. I hate using the Bible because then all the Gnostics will start yelling. But there's a drug that Mary Magdalene gives to Jesus, right? And if you check it out in the Greek, there's not one name for one plant. You guys all know that, right? Because you live that. But modern classicists don't. And in these texts, you have all sorts of different names. You have street names for drugs. Opium. You don't call it opium in the ancient world. You call it the juice, right? So there's a drug vocabulary, and this drug vocabulary hides some very, very, very important ideas. So pick a drug, the one that Mary Magdalene gave to Jesus. What does it do? It's a combination. So what do you do when you break down the 18 different plants that they have? You look for active principles. That's all. It's a shotgun approach. And then you start asking yourselves, how are these things interacting? I'm going to tell you something that is absolutely 100% academically true at the universities today. There is no university on this planet that can take one of these drugs that these female priestesses were using and explain to you what it did in the body. It's impossible. It's impossible. They were using these complex mixtures to treat the feminine being. Now, why would they do this? Why would they do this to these chattel that were sitting at home, right? Not doing anything, right? That's our model of them. Why would they be doing this? So if the oldest medicine is from gynecology, what would we say then if we just, there was a book that just came out of Princeton that said, it's a beautiful book written about oracles and temples where oracles prophesied. And the author of this book is a great, great, great archaeologist. But she said one thing that I thought was it just reveals what our society is all about. She said, I don't understand why 1/3 of the oracles have to do with gynecology. Because those priestesses were giving medical, oracular healing to people. So, of course, they're the ones who knew about the drugs to start with. So do you see how our understanding, because we have put women into a monotheistic box, we lose sight of the history. And that's what Julian, the apostate, said of the Christians teaching the early classics. He said, you cannot let Christians teach myth because they change the meaning. They alter it to fit a monotheistic conception of the universe. So it was kind of and of course he got murdered by a Christian soldier that threw a spear in his back when he was in battle. But Julian was trying to revive. He was trying to revive something that was very old. What are the Christians doing at the very time? How much time do we have? Oh my goodness. Okay. So what are the Christians doing at the time? Step back and say, this is what the pagans are doing. They're using all of these complex chemicals. The women are coming up with ways of regulating, are regulating their menstruation, right, with drugs. They're figuring out ways of causing women to lactate with drugs. So what's going on in the rest of society? What is this movement pushing? To make a long story short, it ultimately pushes the theater. The oracles have all the power, and they're the ones who say you have to have a place where you can speak freely. It's definitely political. You can't look at the activities of women and say they're not involved just pharmacologically. If you just stick to that side, that they aren't involved in shaping society. That's our Christian lens that causes us to see that way. So what are the Christians doing at the time? What are the Christians doing at the time? This will come back to marijuana. I promise I have tie everything together. What are the Christians doing at this time? There's a ritual rape of children. To make a long story short, they were ritually raping children. They had a whole ceremony. Exorcists performed it. They have a theological justification for it, right? And they have it all outlined as to what they were doing. Now I had to put a few things. I had to put Cyril of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Jerusalem, said we can only tell so much about this ritual up until a point. Why can't we talk about what they did? Was they would starve kids. They would take orphans off the street. They would starve them. They would indoctrinate them for several weeks. And then they would put them in underground chambers. He writes about this. It's not me making it up. It's all there. They would put them in underground chambers with exorcists, and they would strip them naked, blindfold the kids and boys, and then put them through, oil them. Sorry, I forgot the oiling. They would oil them. And Cyril's very, very explicit. There's a group of men underground oiling young guys up, and they have to oil them up from the bottom of their feet to the top of their head. And then he goes on this long tirade about, and they don't tell them they don't have to feel bad about what's happening.
You mustn't forget the genitals.
Say again?
That he makes explicit that you shouldn't forget the genitals.
Yeah. So right there, that's something's going on, right? But then he says you get to you have to go through the fires of temptation, and it's actually a mystery ritual. And what happens in the application of the fires is that you're applying sodomy. And there's an entire poetic Christian work written about the war between sodomy, and virtue. Okay, so very sexual. And at this time, what else are the Christians doing? They're saying women are poison. Women are poison, right? Women are poison. I say that very specifically because that's exactly how they say it. The early church fathers are talking about how women are the real enemies of our society. They target women. And that's when they start killing, imprisoning and killing women for carrying around vaginal creams or for carrying around something that can give you an abortion. They start killing people. So this is the environment. This is the struggle between the prevailing, predominantly female priestesses, these medical women. Anyway, let me just make one point about the point that I thought was really maybe good that we could take home, that has to do with marijuana. Now, what about marijuana specifically? Because that's what you guys all want to hear about. You're going to notice right away, everybody says, well, there aren't that many references to marijuana, right? There aren't that many references. There are actually a lot more than you think, just not to cannabis, right? Because of the names. So what is the name? What if you were a Greek gentleman and your daughter was performing in one of these oracles and you're partaking of the incense offering before the ceremony, right? This is your daughter, and it's a big deal for her, big night. And so what do? You sacrifice to Hecate, maybe, and you inhale the incense off of the altar, right? So what else can you do to administer drugs? See, let's approach it from the scientific standpoint. How else can you get those drugs in you? You can inhale. They didn't smoke. You can inhale fumes. They have a squirter that you squirt stuff up. You can squirt stuff up your nose. I'm not quite sure what the draw of that was, but and then the other place. How do you get drugs in? You eat them, but they knew that eating changed the composition of what was going on. So then you can do the old rectal route of administration. So if you look for references now to drugs that do anything rectally, right? So the drug that Mary Magdalene gives Jesus has saponins in it. It's a combination of plants that have saponins that cause anal sphincter spasming. Right? It's an ancient designer sex drug. And Jesus apparently had it when he was, most people don't know, and this is the battle I've been fighting. Nobody reads their Bible anymore. That people need to read the Bible, right? Because there's a naked kid with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Raise your hand if you've heard of the naked kid with Jesus. Look, it's only a couple people.
He's not a kid, but he is adolescent.
Sorry, young man. The naked young man with Jesus. Yeah, sorry. To me, he's a kid, right? But yeah. No, this is not the age group that Dr. Ruck is referring to is how the kid is. He's a neoniskos. He's a gumnos neoniskos. Somewhere around puberty, can be a little bit before. Scholars will argue about how late it goes. Whatever. You're exactly right. It's about puberty, right? And that's where his range is. So they're using these drugs, and that's what's disturbing. This is where it kind of gets disturbing, is what were the Christians battling that would make them want to do these strange rites? If you look at the Greek rites, they were attempting to copy the Greek rites at the same time to alter them so that the Greek gods would not be able to defend their own rights. That was the idea. And how do you do this? Because they believe in demons, right? They believe in demons, these Christians, right? They believe in them just like the Greeks and the Romans do. So you see this intense period of demon fighting, demon possession and demon fighting. And how do they get to some of these fights? Through the drugs that they're putting, to make a long story short, that they're putting on the phallus, and then they're either having vaginal or anal intercourse, well, whatever you call it. What is that? I don't know. But that with a statue. You can use a statue of Priapus, you can use any of the Herms, and with the box that the Dionysiac troupe would carry around, they had some kind of instrument that they used to apply a drug. Was it dildos? We have those from the ancient world, right? Well, all sorts of little statues that are used as we say dildo, but it sounds sexual, doesn't it? It is, but not really. It's the application of a drug, and that's what's strange about it. We don't really get. So what about let me just cut to the chase because I probably have like 5 minutes left. It's the cult of Aphrodite. To make a long story short, I wanted to talk about the cult of Aphrodite here. What do we call, everybody knows this, what do we call the women associated with the cult of Aphrodite? Whores? Anybody else? Courtesans? That's a little more cleaned up, isn't it? Courtesans? I've heard sacred prostitutes. Yeah. Those words are all Christian words. These were not prostitutes. These were priestesses. These were priestesses. And what did these priestesses do? They created the chorus. And what is the chorus? It's a life stage. It's the strangest thing in the world. It's a life stage. The Greeks actually believed, and I can show you this, it's not my words, it's their words, that the immediately post-pubertal female, if given all of the earth's natural mechanisms, drugs, and enough astronomy, geometry, women didn't learn it. Yeah, they did. Astronomy, geometry, dance, poetry, pre-Homeric stuff. Right? This is in the Homeric hymns, right? Now it's post, but it harkens back to earlier stuff. So these girls, you take these girls and they dance. They dance. And they oracularly prophesy. They recite poetry. Right? And you can't touch them. Why can't you touch them? Because anytime you get a bud, it is at its strongest chemical point before it is fertilized, right? Because as soon as the seeds come, you're going to have everything's going to be funneled into creating seeds. So they knew this. The Greeks knew this, and they talk about it. This is the budding of life. This is the Kura, the young girl who's coming to life. And if we can capture that 2 or 3 year period, put her on an intense drug regimen and an intense exercise regimen and an intense education, and we put her up on the altar, and she dances over the fumes, and she's covered in creams. Her vagina is greased with God knows what this stuff did in the body. And if you have her up there, and you can't touch her, by the way, you cannot touch her. If you have her up there, she can speak from the gods. It wasn't one drug. It wasn't just marijuana. It wasn't just LSD. The drug was not the focus. The focus was getting that girl to approach the gods. And that is what the cult of Dionysus is all about. Tione, his mother, her name means the burnt sacrifice, the burnt fumes from the altar. And that's not an altar with an animal. That's an altar with pounds and pounds and pounds of incense that's full of everything. And one of the things that it has in it is STR, asterion in Greek. It is the common name for weed, asterion. It's one of the many ingredients, one of the many. It's the star, right? All these goddesses are all named after the star. And Dioscorides talks about the shape of it and whatnot. You don't see that in the traditional. Everybody said, where'd those texts go? Because you're looking at the wrong names. Find their common names for them, and you can find the drugs. There's a lot about marijuana that we don't know. There's so much. I said when I was coming here, there's so much untranslated. I'm going to give the best picture I can, but there's so much sitting out there waiting to be harvested, mostly in Galen, that it's just amazing. You guys are just on the tip of an iceberg. I mean, this could be, you could take 10 grad students in 10 years and you wouldn't find out everything that's in these formulae, that's in these complex formulae created just to make a chorus. Just to make a chorus. There's no faith. There's no commandments. The idea is it's the natural voice of God. So they would take these, this is the last thing I'll say, they would take these 14, 15-year-old girls and they would decide public policy. They would okay wars. And we have these oracles survived, by the way. I'm not making this up. If you wanted to go to war, you had to ask one of these oracles, right? Isn't that amazing? That's incredible power. That's incredible power. So when we say that women didn't have power, look at the cult of Aphrodite Urania. And is there any way to find a recipe for these drugs? Yes, we have them. They're all written down. You just have to go back and find them. Yeah. There's thousands. There's more written about ancient drugs than any other subject, period. It's the most numerous type of writing. There's thousands of pages of just Galen alone on pharmaceuticals. Yeah. This knowledge of the pharmaceuticals get into the Arab culture. Yeah, it did ultimately, and through formularies. When the Christians decided to burn, because this is what's funny. It's not funny, but when the Christians decided to burn all the women for using drugs, and they really squashed the use of drugs in Roman society, you have a time period where people turn away from that, and the knowledge is preserved throughout. There's like groups that preserve it. And so it's really interesting to follow that. One of the groups that preserved it was the Arabs. But does everybody know what the Arabs studied before? Who did they worship before Allah? Yeah, but who were their primary deities? The Arabs. Herodotus tells us that it was Dionysus and Aphrodite. Dionysus and Aphrodite, that black stone that's associated with the Kaaba and all that. That's all. Sibyl, sure. Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, the cult of Sibyl. We actually have a formula for one of the drugs that the priestesses of Sibyl used. They would take this drug and they would go stand in the common ways, the street intersections, and they would scream. This must have been great to live back then. They would scream crazy stuff. And they were sacrosanct because they were priestesses. They could say anything they wanted. And if there were tyrants who had too much money and power, they were the ones who started saying things about them. These priestesses. Isn't that something? Tremendous political power. You can't really give it an origin, right? Because all it is Astarte and Ishtar, Ashtoreth. It's all the same goddesses who are being, just given different names. But what's important, what I think is important is there's a group of guys called the Orphics, and they start writing poetry. And when I say guys, I don't mean males. There's a group of people who start writing Orphic poetry, and there are all these Orphic hymns that we have to the different gods. And if you look at the influence just of Asterion on that, and I mean, Zeus, what is Zeus called? He's Astropeos. He's the one who sends the fire. It's an important part. It's an important part. But these Orphics, they're really the key. Out goes the light. They're really the key. The Orphics are really the key to understanding how the cult was all fit together. And remember, this is not just the worship of God thingies, right? This is the worship. They didn't worship men in tights, right, on clouds. They didn't worship that. They would be the first to tell you. And you say, what about myth? Myth is all about stories of this. Yes, because if you were an ardent, and this is where I should have started. Maybe I'll finish here, and I should have started here. If you weren't an ardent follower of the Muses, you didn't get it. The Muses were an actual cult. It's one of the oldest that we have in Greece. Why? All of the poetry. How do we know that? All of the poetry harkens back to the worship of this group of goddesses, the Muses. So it's not about the single plant. It's not about the Christian perspective. It's about seeing the choral beauty that they saw. And they would say, that's what transmits freedom and all of these grand science and whatnot, is that song. If your society doesn't have that song, you don't have freedom. Yeah.
So I want to remind everybody to use a mic because we are filming this, and it makes it a little awkward with the questions and stuff like that. But in regards to this cannabis use, how do you think it came into Greece and began to be used this way? And what is there in regards to archaeological evidence to back up this stuff?
Yeah. So if you're gonna ask an archaeologist the second half of that question, I'm not gonna step into an arena that I don't feel I'm 100% I'm good with. We have found, there was a female skeleton found by an Israeli team. I actually did a dig at Megiddo. Has anybody been to Megiddo? It's the site of Armageddon in Israel, right? It's the site where that's supposed to be. So it's funny. I was doing a dig at Armageddon. I don't know. I thought it was funny. So I can't. We did find there's a female skeleton of a girl. She's like 14, and they found cannabis, and they think it has to do with the treatment, right? She was delivering a child. She died from not having a wide enough pelvic girth, right? And they were giving her marijuana. Why would you give somebody marijuana whose pelvis is too small? To relax in the broad ligament, right? To let that thing relax, soften up a little bit, relax, right? So it would have opened it up. That's what they were trying to do. Isn't that interesting? You can take the chemical and you can figure out what was actually going on from the chemical that they were using. But they found this girl and she died, and she had marijuana in her system. That's the archaeological side. What is the real evidence? How do we know how old it is? It must be at least as old as the earliest Greek archaic medicine, because we constantly see the use of the training of priestesses to communicate a drug knowledge to the priestesses. So you can see that in the earliest poetry, you can see that the reference to the star and the reference to we don't just read look where the name is. You look for other. Somebody had the snake up. Who put the snake up on the was Vishnu? Was it Shiva? And I wanted to make sure that didn't escape our notice, because that's how they coded all this stuff, right? Dionysus is always portrayed as going around with X, Y, and Z, right? What is the Sphinx? There's an actual episode in a guy named Nonus. Nobody reads Nonus, right? There's an actual episode where there's a real Sphinx who uses a bow and arrow to strangle someone. So they're using some kind of toxin on the arrow. And since they're constantly talking about where does the toxin come from the snakes, it's probably from the snakes. And what's beautiful is there's a remedy for this. There's a remedy for one of these snake toxins, and you have to. It's beautiful. Nobody looks at this stuff. It's old because it comes from the gynecology, and those are the earliest drugs. Definitely. Yes.
What do you suppose Mary Magdalene gave Jesus a sex drug? To seduce him? To turn him on? To enlighten him? Some combination of all of that? And was that like early in their relationship? Or later? Or much later?
This is
at
right
the
before
time
the garden.
Of his
This is right before the garden, so he's about to get offed. This is his ending. Yes. That is, you could make a drama out of that. A really good drama. But what does the evidence say? Let's just look at what the evidence says about that. So he gives it. What do we know? She gives it to him before the garden. Before he ends up in the garden, that's where he's betrayed. When he's in the garden, he's with that kid in the garden. Is there an association? Was there a reason that he had the linen cloth? The kid had a linen cloth. What do we know about linen? What kind of ceremonies is that used in? Why is it that Jesus' apostles are standing at a distance? Why is it a public park at 2 o'clock in the morning? Right? Why is Jesus dealing with a prostitute in the first place? And what is that prostitute? That's what our understanding of the term is. How did the Greeks and the Romans and the Hellenists that lived in the mishmash of Judea, how did they interpret that? People have asked me, because with the book that's just coming out, they asked me, what is your problem with what Jesus was doing? I had an evangelical stop me on the street, and he said, "Hey brother, can I answer any of your questions about Jesus?" And so I said, "Oh, he's asking for it." So I said, because I really do. I say this here. I'm not mocking, because I want to find out what is the rationale. And I say, why? Okay, so he said, "Do you have any questions, brother?" And I said, "Yeah, why was Jesus with a naked kid in the Garden of Gethsemane?" And he laughed. And he said, "I've read my Bible many, many a time, but I've never seen that." And so I said, "Mark 14, 51, 52. So he looked shocked, and he opened up the Bible, and he looked at it. And I kid you not, this is what he said. He stood there and read it, and I was watching him. And he said, "You mean for everything that Jesus did for you, just because he was with this naked kid, you wouldn't believe him? And that's the exact answer that the early church gives. It's the exact same answer that the early church gives. It's amazing. Nobody ever answers this question. So if you look at, last sentence. If you look at the actual pharmacy and you look at the biology and you look at all the history and you look at the linguistics, you can figure out what he was doing there, right? You can figure it out. Yeah.
Hi. When you mentioned the snake, I started thinking about the myth of the Garden of Eden and how the snake and the woman are associated and are evil. Does that mean that the Judaic church also tried to persecute? And
I'll let a Greek answer that for you. I won't give you the answer. I'll let a Greek do it. It's Typhon. It's the monster Typheus, right? Why would the Jewish Orthodox Jews, why would they have an anti-woman approach? Why do Muslims who are on their end, I'm not talking Sufis and all that, but extremist Muslims, why do they always want to put the Taliban? Why do they want to put women in burqas? Why do they want to throw acid in their faces? Why did the Christians burn women alive and shut down colleges for women? Why did they do that? The Greeks already gave the answer. It's Typheus. Zeus has to beat Typheus. Typheus is monotheism. The Jews that came out of Egypt followed Set, right, as a monotheistic god, the enemy of Aphrodite and Dionysus. It's all they knew the problems. They knew the problems. Christianity's problem for the Greeks was that they were atheists. You know what the Greeks called the early Christians? Atheists. How could they call them atheists? That's what people call people who are not Christians now, right? Do you see what happens? They adopt. The aggressor adopts the tactics of the people they filled the position for, right? The pagans disappeared, the Christians came in, they start using this tactic. It's amazing. It's beautiful, kind of beautiful history. But anyway, did that answer the question?
That's a yes there.
Yeah, but say your question again, because I think you're making a very, very important point.
Oh, it was just, was the Judaic church anti-women? Was that the creation, the Garden of Eden myth, an attack at women and their power over medicine?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. It's a way of establishing power for a specific group. Yeah.
yeah, just to repeat it, was the Garden of Eden myth a direct attack on women due to their power of medicine?
Right, and the Christians use it that way
so
too.
You're saying yes?
Definitely, and,
okay.
and one other way of proving that is the Christians use the very same approach.
Exactly. It seemed like
Eve
very similar.
the-
It's like, oh, it
Eve
predates
is the-
Christianity then.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And why would they use Eve? Because she had already been set as an example of what's evil in the Word. And by the way, they even went so far as to say the name Eve, these are the Greeks, the name Eve is related to the sacred name for, guess who? Dionysus. Yeah. Yeah. Right? It's very weird. It's like it's when you start realizing the word for medicine in Greek, iatros, the word for doctor, that's the word for physician, iao, it comes from the verb iao, is also a word that means the cry. This is so weird when I read this. The cry that a woman delivering a child gives. Isn't that weird? That's its own thing, and that's what means medicine. That's where medicine comes from, right? And the arrow drugs to cause the uterus to contract and all that. It's beautiful stuff.
And so organized religion has been an attack on healers this whole time. That's weird. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Rook.
Iatos can be made into a person. I mean, the kraia can be made into iatos.
Right.
Iatos is the name of Bacchus.
It's a way of celebrating. And it's a way of celebrating. And why this connection between Bacchus and Aphrodite. Why do some of the earliest statues of Aphrodite that they say are some sort of Mithraic thing, they all have penises? What? Right? Ancient statues with penises. It's very... Why would you need a penis on a female statue? Yeah. No, I'm serious. I'm really asking. Can anybody... Why would you need it? Dr. Ruck?
Because she's superior. She has both sexes.
And you can use that because she's superior. She has both sexes. She's like Phanes, this early Greek god that's both masculine and feminine. And you wrap snakes around. He's got snakes wrapped around he, she. It's like a he, she kind of thing. And also. Okay, thank you. It's been great.